Okay, great. Thanks so much. So I'm one of the non-economists here, but I think you'll be happy to hear that we're not as different as we may think. And some of the concepts and even some of the data is going to be quite similar to the previous presentation. So this is a project that I've been working on with Malika Arslan, who can't be here today. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute in Cologne. This is a project that is supported by the Economic Security Project, which is part of a bigger project looking at comparative state aid policy, primarily across European and North American jurisdictions, and with a particular focus on business power, right? But as you'll see, this paper is kind of our attempt to take a step back from sort of our primary focus of sort of doing causal explanation and really try to understand what is the phenomenon we're looking at. And in particular, what we're focused on is a subset of place-based policies, what we're calling subnational subnational investment subsidies. And these include, of course, public grants, tax increment financing, other kinds of loans, and we're thinking of this very much in a broad way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through sort of a very brief overview of the current literature on tax incentives and subnational investment subsidies. Then I'll look at some of our initial analysis of heterogeneity, both across subsidies in general, as well as the mega deals that were mentioned earlier. Then I'm going to introduce our typology, and I'm going to give a few contrasting examples in two states, and if we have time, maybe some additional ones as well. Okay, so we know what locational investment subsidies are: direct and indirect public subsidies, tax breaks, other financial benefits provided to business enterprises in exchange for an investment, usually in a particular place. Historically, sort of, we see the most prominent use of these in kind of the beginning of the 1940s and 50s in southern states through municipal bond financing, with the primary aim to lure northern manufacturing into the South. They also attracted them through having very weak labor laws. But one element was essentially taking away some of the risk of investment in new places. We also know that since the 80s, the aggregate amount of investment subsidies has really significantly increased in real dollars. Of course, this is not something we know precisely because there are so many governments in this country and there are so many different programs, and how do you even quantify the value of a loan, for instance, a subsidized loan? But most people who have looked at this really do point to a clear secular increase, some pointing to maybe a quadrupling since the 80s. But since about 2005, 2010, it's been fairly steady. So we haven't really seen a continued escalation, but let's say a sustained amount of spending. We also, as most of us are aware, there have been a significant number of really large deals, what we're calling mega deals, like the previous speaker. The classic example being the Amazon HQ2 subsidy competition that pitted jurisdictions directly against each other. I think there were 238 cities and states that made a bid for Amazon's other headquarters. We also see this at the municipal level with the Kansas City border wars that were just mentioned. We're really going to focus only on state level subsidies. So we're excluding municipal in part because that data coverage is not as good, and then we're not looking at federal at all because we think there's a different political economy, a different logic there. So we're really looking at diversity within state level subsidies. This is a rich literature, and there's been a lot of different papers on this, but if we were to summarize the main takeaways from both economics and political science, it would be as such. Economists usually find that these deals don't produce the outcomes that they claim, right? We saw some of that evidence in the previous speaker. They don't work, they don't produce jobs, they're not necessarily good for encouraging entrepreneurship, et cetera. Political scientists, I guess, sort of respond to that finding by saying, but they do work quite well for helping politicians get reelected, right? And there's a lot of evidence that incumbents benefit greatly when they open a deal or when they snag a big company, regardless of whether or not it's actually good for the public interest. It certainly is benefiting politicians. And sort of the extent to which it benefits them depends upon the local system. There's lots of variation, but that's the main takeaway. And we're not necessarily disputing either of these findings. But what we are concerned about is that we're lumping all of the subsidies together and then looking at average effects, and there actually might be different kinds of programs that do work better or might have different logics. Even if they do serve politicians, that may not be the only thing they're doing, right? After all, we do live in a political economy where we need politicians to get rewarded for what they do, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad policy. And we're very much responding to, I guess, a debate in economic sociology and political economy rather than necessarily, this great work in the top of the slide, who, for the most part, have ignored subnational investment incentives, right? If you kind of think about like the entrepreneurial state and these kinds of things, it's not really focused on these kinds of programs, right? If anything, these programs are seen as corporate welfare, smokestack chasing, supply-side inducements that basically reflect the vulnerability and powerlessness of states in the face of footloose transnational capital, right? I mean, if we were to kind of really get down to the basic conclusion. Well, we think this is too simplistic. Like I just said, we need to go beyond a single category or even a single dimension of variation. And then also there's a tendency to view developments in a diachronic way. Sort of all subsidies are moving in one direction, right? So sort of it's, Peter Eisinger's great work in the 80s actually predicted that things were moving away from supply side to demand side, right? That states were being forced to not just compete directly for factories, but instead start to invest in shifting demand, right? But then in the present day, we often see the opposite prediction, that sort of we're moving from a Fordist system where the state had some power vis-a-vis capital more toward a system where states are quite powerless. And as historical institutionalists who are trained in kind of the comparative political economy, comparative economic sociology tradition, we, of course, are skeptical kind of intuitively about any claim that like a common secular trend is going to lead to the same institutional response across countries or that globalization will lead to convergence. We actually think there's a lot of reasons why a common trend will actually lead to diversification of policies as states seek to kind of carve out different niches, et cetera, as we see, for instance, in the varieties of capitalism literature. Okay, so this is a typological study. We're not focused on causal inference. Our aim is to identify how subsidy logics differ rather than why different strategies emerge. And we rely on extreme cases to build ideal types, which we then sort of try to imply empirically. And this is Max Weber in 1918 reminding us all to think hard about our concepts before we run our experiments. Okay, and the data, it's the same data that was used in the previous presentation. We've started to do some Orbis matching so we can get a better sense of the kinds of companies that are receiving subsidies in certain states. That is not complete yet, so I won't be presenting that today. We've also done hand coding of 400 mega deals. These are the deals that are valued at 50 million or more. And for these, we've really tried to kind of not necessarily do many case studies, but really understand, based on news articles, other reports, what was entailed with each one of these deals, and then to classify these deals in terms of sort of market failures that were possibly addressed in the deal. What is the dynamic in terms of relocation or the purpose of the deal? These kinds of things. And then we conduct case studies in 4 states. I'm going to present 2 of those case studies today. Okay, so real quick, here are a few dimensions of variation. This is looking at the broad data of about 600,000 awards that are in this database. You can see there's a lot of diversity across states in the intensity per capita, right? And it's not necessarily clear what organizes that logic. It's not a red state, blue state logic, rural state, urban state. There's just very different kinds of policy, kinds of intensity of subsidy spending across different states. We can also see that there are a lot of different instruments used. So clearly, tax expenditures are the largest, right? And that includes a lot of different things. But significant amounts are also spent through the enterprise zone, through direct grants, and cost reimbursements at the state level. You can also see that there is diversity in the kinds of projects that are supported, right? So about half are manufacturing facilities of some kind, right? So that clearly is, really is the most common kind of big deal. But we also see, corporate relocations, shipping and distribution centers, real estate deals. That's especially true for tax increment financing, and even research and R&D facilities. And while the common perception is that these deals are often the big deals, this is the big deal analysis, that the big deals often involve some kind of jurisdictional competition between states. We find in our qualitative coding that only about 13% clearly involve relocation from one state to another. Okay. The biggest category is an entirely new US facility, right? So it's not replacing something. Often this is when maybe a foreign firm moves in. So there we do see some interjurisdictional competition, but not always. But we also, there are significant numbers that go to retaining jobs, and then also expanding existing facilities. So there's a lot of different kinds of things going on, even in these big deals. And then a lot of the big deals do include, let's say, some ostensible market failure kind of goal. I'm not saying that that's the real thing that's going on or it works, but that is at least part of the deal. So a lot of deals involve infrastructure spending, some R&D. We also see that even some of these kind of race to the bottom deals do at least appear to reflect an industrial policy logic in terms of an infant industry development in the state or an agglomeration strategy. And then finally, most of the deals do result in facilities that when we looked in 2023 were still in existence, right? And some of these deals go back to the 90s, right? So about 10 to 11%, the facility doesn't seem to exist anymore. Okay, so here is the way we organize the different logics of these sort of deals. And again, we're not saying they're equally represented in the deals. That's an empirical question. But here are different ways we could think of the logic of deals. So we divide it along two dimensions. So the first is the market orientation. Do the deals or the awards seek to encourage investment by lowering production factor costs without shifting market signals, right? So sort of subsidizing the cost of labor, subsidizing the cost of land, et cetera, okay? Or do they seek to shape investment in some way toward a social purpose other than the firm's direct profit incentive, right? By addressing market failure, by creating public goods like infrastructure, R&D, or by steering a deal toward some kind of particular goal, technology, development, et cetera. And then we also then look at a second dimension that relies on the traditional industrial policy distinction between horizontal initiatives and vertical initiatives. So this distinction is very much embedded in EU state aid law. And we think it's also a useful category to think about US investment subsidies. So are the awards or the programs available to all firms in a wide range of sectors, or are they really targeted toward a narrow area, right? And of course, we can argue over exactly how to distinguish this, but in principle, we should be able to distinguish between these kinds of deals. And that produces our four kind of ideal types. I mean, laissez-faire subsidies in the top left. This is sort of when the state essentially says, let's not have any taxes at all for business. This is like the South Dakotan example where 83% of state revenue comes from the sales tax. That's, in our view, a horizontal subsidy, right? Because every business basically doesn't pay tax. And then in addition to that, South Dakota throws in a lot of investment subsidies for recovering property tax and the few taxes that businesses do pay. This we view as quite different than a beggar thy neighbor subsidy, which involves a lot of state spending to recruit particular industries, right, without necessarily trying to shape the direction of investment or the kinds of technology that is used. Then we go down to the bottom right. This we call developmental subsidies. These are market-shaping vertical initiatives where tax incentives or subsidies are used to try to achieve some kind of state-determined industrial policy goal. And then finally, we have market-shaping and horizontal initiatives, which are very much focused on addressing market failures without necessarily targeting particular sectors, technologies, and firms. Okay, so here is one of our cases. So Alabama is a state that, as I said before, was a pioneer of municipal bond financing in the 40s and 50s. And during this period, the state didn't really it didn't really have a coherent industrial policy in terms of trying to attract a specific set of sectors or firms. But this began to change in the 1990s, right? And the watershed moment was the luring of Mercedes-Benz to open its first North American plant in, I believe, Tuscaloosa. And as part of that initiative, they not only gave, I guess, Mercedes $300 million, which that was in 1993 dollars, but they also changed their policy. They passed what's called the Mercedes-Benz legislation, and they developed what actually reads very much like a sort of European industrial champion policy. They say, look, we want to recruit auto companies. We have no auto companies here. This is going to be our plan, and we're going to just systematically recruit and target auto companies to come to the state. And since then, you can see they've done a lot of that, right? I mean, strikingly, I think 8 or maybe 7 of the 10 biggest deals are all foreign companies, many of which are in the auto or aviation sectors. And a lot of these deals really were the result of very clear interstate competition. Sometimes dozens of different bids, and Alabama just was willing to just always go past what any other state would offer. And as a result, we do see a quite substantial auto industry in Alabama today. I mean, it started out at 0, and now there are 54,000 jobs in the auto sector. Now, we can argue whether this really, what's the opportunity cost of this, of course. But it has sort of worked, and it does seem to be durable, and Alabama has almost as many manufacturing jobs as Michigan, right? So it is the most industrialized state in the South. It would be very hard to imagine Alabama politicians reversing this policy, right, anytime soon. But the cost has been an average of $361,000 per job, so it's a lot of money. Okay, this is sort of a very different kind of logic than what we've seen in Michigan, okay? So Michigan, of course, starts from a very different place. It has all the auto companies, right? It's the birthplace of the three big ones. And beginning in the 1960s, we know the auto industry started to shed jobs, and in the 70s, Michigan really faced some major economic problems and crises. And in response, Michigan initially pursued what we consider to be market-conforming strategies. They just sort of significantly reduced property taxes. They created a new way industrial property tax worked that significantly cut the tax bill. But then in the 1980s, they started to in addition to that, do more market-shaping vertical strategies. So they created a number of strategic funds, kind of sort of state venture capital funds that started to invest in high-tech, knowledge economy type stuff, commercializing University of Michigan projects, things like this, okay? And then in the early 2000s, they created a number of new entities. One was the Michigan Economic Growth Authority, which would identify sort of upgrade manufacturing, higher value added products. And then more recently, they've started to really invest in advanced battery manufacturing. So they passed the country's first kind of battery sort of tax credit. Sort of any kind of battery manufacturing gets a significant cut to taxes. They've also identified wind energy, solar energy, bioenergy as prime sectors for subsidy investment. And when we look at their mega deals, they look quite different than the mega deals in Alabama, right? They're kind of equally substantial in size, but almost all of the deals go to local companies that already are in existence. So it's sort of more about trying to change and transform the capacities of your existing resources rather than sort of rather than try to lure whoever wants to invest into your state. And 8 of the 36 have gone to some kind of green initiative, right? Particularly related to electric vehicles. And then they also have created the Office of Future Mobility and Electrification that is very much sort of concerned with developing new unproven technologies. So in our view, this is a good example, at least in part, of a kind of more developmental approach to the use of investment subsidies. How much time do I have?
You've got 10 minutes total, more questions.
Okay. Well, I'll just do California really quickly because I think it's interesting. So California is is a great example of a state that really has not used mega deals at all, right? More recently, there have been a couple, but considering the size of their economy, they have a very low per capita spending on like really big initiatives. But what they do is they have significant subsidies for exports and research and development, right? So they have what I believe is, after Hawaii, is the most generous R&D tax credit in the country. I think you can get like 24% back or something like that. And this is used by a wide variety of knowledge economy firms, right? So it's not particularly targeted. It wouldn't, in our view, be a good example of vertical policy. And it's by far the most expensive subsidy. So it's sort of, in 2012, it was around 45% of total spending. In addition to that, we do see some of the horizontal market-conforming strategies, some vertical targeting toward the film industry, computer programming, farmers, right? Most states have some element of this. What's interesting about even their market-conforming horizontal and vertical policies is that they tend to be more conditional, right? They tend to require more proof the jobs are created. There's also very strong clawback provisions. So I think the California Competes program, which we classify as horizontal and market conforming, the states recovered more than a third of the money, right? Because often, as we know, firms don't actually deliver what they promise. And California seems to be transforming even even these kinds of sort of beggar thy neighbor subsidies into something where the state is able to leverage more direction than certainly in Alabama and other states in the South. Okay, so now I'm going back to my conclusion. Okay, so this is, we hope, a helpful theory building exercise to develop a sort of way to maybe categorize different kinds of programs and then maybe analyze different categories of programs. We also think that these differing cases are a good reflection of some of the diversity and heterogeneity of state policy. We don't necessarily suggest here that any state can do any strategy. You need to understand exactly how path dependencies and different structures affect things. But we also do want to assert that there is some agency here, right? You could imagine shifting slowly or adding different kinds of programs, making programs more conditional, adding, sort of perhaps some developmental subsidies to go along with horizontal subsidies. And then, we hope now to kind of move more to the politics, right? To sort of do some interviews and try to understand exactly what's going on behind the scenes in terms of state decision-making and program design, and also how policy learning occurs. Because one other kind of finding is that the policy programs are constantly being adjusted, right, and adapted. And so there is a potential here, I do think, for important social learning in this sphere. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, please.
Thanks. This is great. Very much dialogue. I want to get more. I want to ask you if you guys distinguish. I like your distinction between market shaping and market forming. I was not sure if you have an argument about which one would be more productive, or I mean, except that there's a difference between them. But are you also saying that one is better than the other, one is more effective than the other, or both of them are, would be okay?
In this paper, we're really not trying to say one is better than the other. I mean, we maybe have our personal views. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I would like to think that maybe shaping, if the state's going to give money to a company, there should be something that they get back for that, right, in terms of social public purpose. So I would say, that probably is a better way forward, but you could make arguments that in certain contexts, a market-conforming strategy is what you need to attract capital to the state. So perhaps in certain contexts, you just don't have enough to offer. And so maybe having too many conditionalities, could undermine that effort. Yeah.
In 2014, the Inter-American Development Bank issued a flagship report called Rethinking Productive Development Policies. And they created a framework that looks very much like yours.
Okay.
Like 2 by 2, almost the same. And regarding your question, the tone was quite clear that we have too much of subsidies of shaping, and there was a lot to do about, there have been a lot of conforming.
Oh, okay.
And a lot to do about shaping.
I would love to see that paper if you can find the reference.
Yeah, it's just a flagship report, 2014.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, in the back.
I'd like to know something about the institutional requirements of different policies. So what strikes me about the California case is that if you're going to have clawbacks, you have to have pretty good monitoring of the things, whereas in the Alabama case, my assumption is these do not require a lot of monitoring in their state capacity.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the implications of you going into that?
Well, I think that's the next stage. I mean, Alabama's been moving, though, all states have been moving toward more transparency and more conditionality, right? Just in the Alabama case, the conditionality would be, did you produce the jobs? Not did you achieve other social objectives? So that might be a positive trend, is that more people are interested, and states do seem to be at least improving transparency reporting and clawbacks. And did I see Matthias? You had your, yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful. I have a question about the Michigan Economic Development Corporation.
Uh-huh.
And also in the prior talk we were told about the certified financial institutions. Is this a development bank? Is it not? And if it's not, what makes it different from a development bank? These corporations that you're mentioning.
Yeah. Oh, you're the development bank expert, so maybe I should get your definition first. I mean, it seems like a development bank. Some of them do seem kind of like a development bank to me.
Okay, so there's basically
Yeah.
a literature that is missing.
Okay, great.
US development banking. No.
Yeah,
Interesting. Yeah.
great. No, that's interesting. Yeah.
So on your typologies, first thing, having spent the past 15 years in the southeast of the U.S. looking applying these terms to the policy, I'm not sure if it's, I'm trying to still think about how you're putting together aims and means.
Uh-huh.
Tax breaks are everywhere, and that's not a very, I don't think that's the most effective thing that you may want to think about, as opposed to
Yeah.
doing what, like Rick was saying, is what are the means to try to stimulate what you're trying to do? So in the Southeast, they readily say now, it was all, like you said, it was jobs and the size of the deal for 25 years. And now they're shifting. They're overtly, they're very publicly saying we have to create more value added. By the way, they don't know how to do that necessarily. Because what it means is they have to change the means. Like they, you know, sure, throw some money at research or education, but actually how it works. You know,
Sure.
does that mean, so I'm thinking, and they're both, by the way, as they do that, they're both really interested in attracting new investors outside the state, as opposed to necessarily transforming their local actors. So, do you see what I'm saying?
Sure, sure.
One's all about jobs, the other one's about value and science. And they're both still shopping foreigners, right? That's what they're trying to do. But they're actually having to change, they've gone well beyond tax credits.
Yeah, I would love to talk to you more about what's been happening. I'm from North Carolina myself, so I kind of always had the example of RTP in the background as something, and I do think that is a model in the South. But when you look at the actual deals, there aren't that many RTP-like models in the South. I mean, I'm sure they're talking about it, and perhaps this is because of capacity limitations. Yeah. Okay, one more maybe, and then, okay. Yeah.
I'm super curious about the distinction between policies that change the conditions for local companies versus try to lure companies in.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a lot of cases, and I'm thinking about Alabama, that over time the luring in of companies actually ends up materially more changing the local conditions for other companies operating in that region. And like recently, we have Ford choosing to put a new battery manufacturing plant in Tennessee rather than in Michigan, despite all of these kind of local changes.
Yeah.
That you're seeing, and so I'm just like curious, like how you think about, when you're distinguishing between, I guess, market conforming and market shaping, is that basically just saying that you're attracting incumbents versus like you're trying to, change what people
Sure.
are doing, and how do you account for situations where the attraction of those incumbents actually changes what's happening and ends up shaping the market in the ground?
Yes, so the original Isinger distinction between supply side and demand side was very much focused on, are you getting new companies or are you transforming existing companies? So we kind of do build upon that, but also maybe move beyond it. And then in terms of the evolving political economy, that's going to be something I'm quite interested in, is sort of whether when you create more industrial jobs in Alabama, that shifts the politics of Alabama. Unfortunately, these jobs don't tend to be unionized, so that's not going to, in part because the state doesn't insist upon it. And so it's not going to create a kind of, it's not going to make it Detroit, right? But perhaps it still will shift things in ways we can't fully appreciate. Okay, thank you so much.